I was standing outside Umberto's clam house in Little Italy when the shots rang out. April 7th, 1972. It was just past 5 a.m., and most of the neighborhood was still asleep. But inside that seafood restaurant, Crazy Joe Gallo was celebrating his 43rd birthday with his family when three men walked in and changed everything. The gunfire shattered the early morning silence. 5 shots, maybe 6, I lost count. People started screaming. Tables crashed over. And then, suddenly, silence. When the smoke cleared, Joey Gallo lay dead on the sidewalk outside, his birthday celebration ending in blood on the pavement where he'd crawled trying to escape. I'd known Joey, not well, but enough to understand he was different from other mobsters. He read Sartre and Camus in prison. He kept a pet lion named Cleo in his basement. He befriended black prisoners when other Italian mobsters wouldn't even acknowledge them. He hung out with celebrities and intellectuals who found his blend of violence and philosophy fascinating. He was, in every sense, crazy, but crazy like a fox, or maybe just crazy enough to think he could rewrite the rules of the Mafia. His death that morning was the violent conclusion to a story that had been building for years, a story that involved 2 other men who'd also dared to challenge the system in their own ways. Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter and Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, who thought his brutality made him untouchable until he was gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop 15 years earlier. And Joe Colombo, who tried to legitimize the mob by creating a civil rights organization, only to be shot down at his own rally by a black gunman that many believe Gallo had sent. These 3 men, Anastasia, Colombo, and Gallo, represented something different in the Mafia. They weren't content to follow the old rules, to keep quiet and stay in the shadows. They pushed boundaries, challenged authority, and paid the ultimate price for their ambition and arrogance. I was there for parts of their stories, working in the restaurants and social clubs where deals were made and death sentences pronounced. I served drinks to men who would be dead within weeks. I swept up the morning after meetings where murders were planned, and I was there in the aftermath, watching as each of these men learned the same hard lesson, that in the Mafia, the most dangerous thing you could be is different. The Lord High Executioner, Umberto Albert Anastasia, was born in 1902 in Tropea, Italy, arriving in America as a teenager in 1917. Like thousands of Italian immigrants, he came seeking opportunity. Unlike most, he found in murder. By the 1920s, Anastasia had already killed at least once, murdering a longshoreman named George Torino during a dispute on the Brooklyn docks. He was convicted and sentenced to death, sitting on death row at Sing Sing prison for 18 months. But in a pattern that would define his entire career, witnesses suddenly changed their testimony, evidence disappeared, and Anastasia walked free on a technicality. That escape from death row seemed to give Anastasia a sense of invincibility. If he could beat the electric chair once, what could touch him? He threw himself into organized crime with a ferocity that frightened even hardened criminals. During the Castellamarese War of the early 1930s, Anastasia sided with Lucky Luciano and helped orchestrate the murders of the old guard bosses Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. I knew men who worked on the docks during Anastasia's reign, and they all said the same thing. He was the most terrifying person they'd ever encountered. It wasn't just that he was violent. Lots of mobsters were violent. Anastasia seemed to enjoy it, to take pleasure in causing fear and inflicting pain. He had a hair-trigger temper that could explode over the smallest perceived slight. When Luciano reorganized the Mafia in the 1930s, he rewarded Anastasia's loyalty by placing him in charge of Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. Alongside Louis Lepka Buckelter, Anastasia commanded a crew of professional killers who operated out of a candy store in Brooklyn's Brownsville neighborhood. Murder Incorporated, the killing machine. Murder Incorporated was organized crime's most efficient innovation, a corporation dedicated solely to murder. Local bosses across the country could contract for hits without using their own men, ensuring no connection between the victim and the person who ordered the killing. The killers were professionals who traveled to unfamiliar cities, executed their targets, and disappeared. Between 1929 and 1941, Murder Incorporated is estimated to have carried out between 400 and 1,000 contract killings. The exact number will never be known because many victims simply disappeared. their bodies never found. Anastasia oversaw this machinery of death with cold efficiency, earning him the nickname Lord High Executioner. But Anastasia wasn't content to just manage killers. He participated in murders himself, seemingly unable to resist the thrill. I heard stories about Anastasia personally strangling victims, shooting people in the street, and beating men to death with his bare hands. For him, murder wasn't just business, it was personal gratification. The one time I saw Anastasia in person, he was leaving a restaurant in Manhattan, surrounded by bodyguards. He was shorter than I expected, maybe 5'7", but built like a bull. Thick chest, powerful arms, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His eyes were what struck me most. Dark, cold, completely devoid of warmth or empathy. They were a predator's eyes. In 1951, Anastasia's position grew even stronger when Vincent Mangano, the boss of what would become the Gambino family, disappeared along with his brother Philip. Everyone knew Anastasia had ordered the hit. Mangano had been his boss, and tensions between them had been escalating for years, but nobody could prove it. With Mangano gone, Anastasia took over as boss of the family. The cracks began to show. By the mid-1950s, Anastasia controlled New York's waterfront, ran one of the 5 families, and was one of the most feared men in America. But his brutality was becoming a problem. The modern mafia that Luciano had created was supposed to be about business, not bloodlust. Anastasia's unpredictable violence attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement and made other bosses nervous. In 1952, Anastasia watched televised hearings where informant Abe Relis testified about murder incorporated before dying in a mysterious fall from a hotel window. The televised hearings enraged Anastasia, but what happened next showed how unhinged he'd become. A Brooklyn man named Arnold Schuster had spotted bank robber Willie Sutton and called police. When Schuster appeared on television describing how he'd recognized Sutton, Anastasia went into a rage. "I can't stand squealers," Anastasia allegedly screamed. "Hit that guy." The problem was that Schuster had nothing to do with the mafia. He was just a civilian who'd spotted a wanted criminal. Killing him served no purpose except satisfying Anastasia's hatred of informants. But Anastasia ordered it anyway, and Schuster was gunned down in the street. The murder caused a public outcry and brought intense police pressure on the mob. Other bosses were furious that Anastasia had killed a civilian for no strategic reason. Vito Genovese, who'd been maneuvering for years to increase his power, saw an opportunity. He began quietly building a coalition against Anastasia, convincing other bosses that the Mad Hatter had become too unstable, too dangerous to lead. Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's own underboss, was convinced to betray his boss. The hit was ordered. Now it just needed executioners. That's where Joey Gallo and his brothers entered the story. The Barbershop Quartet. Joseph Gallo was born in Brooklyn on April 7, 1929. He grew up in the Red Hook neighborhood, a tough Italian-American enclave where the mafia's influence was inescapable. By his teens, Joey was already running with street gangs, stealing jukeboxes and cigarette machines with his brothers Larry and Albert, known as Kid Blast. But even early on, Joey was different. While other young criminals were content with petty theft and street fights, Joey read books, asked questions, and thought about bigger things. He was also, by several accounts, genuinely unstable. In 1950, after an arrest, psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. The diagnosis earned him a new nickname, Crazy Joe. By the mid-1950s, the Gallo brothers were working as enforcers for Joe Prophesy, one of New York's original 5 family bosses. They ran a crew that controlled rackets in South Brooklyn, specializing in extortion, loan sharking, and the jukebox business, which was more profitable and violent than it sounds. If a bar or restaurant wanted a jukebox, they bought it from the Gallos. If they didn't want one, the Gallos would explain, usually with threats or violence, why they needed one anyway. I worked in a bar in Red Hook during this period, and I remember when the Gallo crew came to install our jukebox. Joey didn't even come inside. He sent his guys in, and 20 minutes later, we had a jukebox we didn't need, and were paying weekly fees we couldn't afford. That was how it worked. In 1957, according to multiple sources, Joe Prophesy allegedly asked the Gallo brothers to carry out a hit on Albert Anastasia. The reasons were complex: Prophesy wanted to curry favor with Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, who were plotting Anastasia's removal. The Gallos, ambitious and fearless, agreed to do it. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walked into the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for a shave and haircut. It was a routine he'd followed for years, a moment of relaxation in an otherwise violent life. He settled into the barber's chair, a hot towel over his face, completely vulnerable. Two men wearing scarves over their faces walked in. They pulled out guns and opened fire. Anastasia, seeing them in the mirror, tried to fight back, lunging at their reflections in confusion, but the bullets tore through him. He died on the barbershop floor, shot 5 times, his blood mixing with shaving cream. The assassination of Albert Anastasia shocked the underworld. He'd been one of the most powerful and feared mobsters in America, yet he'd been killed in broad daylight in a Manhattan hotel. The hit announced that nobody was untouchable, no matter how much blood they'd spilled or how much fear they'd inspired. Years later, Joey Gallo would brag publicly about the Anastasia hit, telling people, "You could just call us the Barbershop Quartet." Whether he actually participated or was just taking credit for a famous murder, the claim established his reputation as someone willing to kill anyone, even untouchable bosses like Anastasia. The First Colombo War. For the Gallo brothers, the Anastasia hit should have been the beginning of their rise to power. Instead, it marked the start of their downfall. Joe Prophesy, the boss they'd killed for, refused to properly reward them. The Gallos were getting rich from their rackets, but they had to kick up a huge percentage to Prophesy while getting little in return. It was the old Mafia system. The bosses took most of the money while the soldiers did the work and took the risks. By 1960, the Gallos were fed up. Joey, never one to follow traditional mob protocol, decided to do something unprecedented. He kidnapped his own boss's top leaders. In February 1961, the Gallo crew grabbed 4 high-ranking members of the Prophesy family, including underboss Joseph Magliocco, and held them hostage, demanding a better deal. The move was audacious and insane. You didn't kidnap your own bosses. It violated every rule of Mafia conduct. But Joey didn't care about rules. He wanted what he believed he'd earned, and he was willing to go to war to get it. The hostages were eventually released after negotiations, but the damage was done. Joe Prophesy agreed to better terms for the Gallos, but everyone knew it was temporary. Neither side intended to honor the peace. It was just a pause before the shooting started. The First Colombo War erupted in 1961 and would drag on for years, leaving bodies scattered across Brooklyn. The Prophesy family tried to eliminate the Gallos multiple times. In one infamous incident, Larry Gallo was lured to the Sahara Lounge in Brooklyn, where a rope was thrown around his neck and assassins began strangling him. He was saved only when a police officer happened to walk in, scaring off the would-be killers. But before the war could reach its conclusion, Joey Gallo was arrested on extortion charges in 1961 and sentenced to 7 to 14 years in prison. The timing couldn't have been worse or better, depending on your perspective. While imprisoned, Joey couldn't continue the fight against Prophesy, but he also wasn't on the streets where he could be killed. Prison transformation. Prison changed Joey Gallo, though whether it made him better or just more dangerous is debatable. While locked up, he underwent what can only be called a transformation. He read voraciously philosophy, literature, political theory. He studied Sartre, Camus, and Kafka. He took up painting. He started thinking of himself as an intellectual, a philosopher trapped in a gangster's body. More significantly, Joey did something almost unheard of for an Italian mobster. He befriended black prisoners. In an era when racial segregation was the norm in both prison and the underworld, Gallo formed genuine friendships across racial lines. He learned about the struggles of black communities, and they learned about Italian organized crime. I knew a guy who did time with Joey in Auburn, and he told me that Gallo was genuinely different from other Italian mobsters. He didn't see race the way they did. He saw potential allies, people who were tough, organized, and excluded from traditional mafia structure. Joey was building an army, but not the kind anyone expected. While Joey was in prison, the mob world outside was changing. Joe Prophesy died of cancer in 1962. His successor, Joseph Magliocco, tried to consolidate power, but was soon forced out. In 1963, the family came under the control of Joseph Colombo, a relatively young boss who'd been a captain under Prophesy. Colombo represented a new generation. He was smoother than the old-timers, more image-conscious, and he had big ideas about how to run a modern crime family. When Joey Gallo was released from prison in 1971, he came home to a world where Joseph Colombo was now his boss, a situation neither man was happy about. Joe Colombo's vision. Joseph Colombo was born in 1923 in Brooklyn, the son of an Italian immigrant who was himself a mobster. He joined the organization young, working his way up through the ranks with intelligence and political savvy rather than the overwhelming violence that characterized earlier generations. By 1963, at just 40 years old, Colombo was boss of his own family, the organization that now bore his name. But Colombo had a problem shared by all the mob bosses of the 1960s and 70s: increased law enforcement pressure. The FBI had launched aggressive campaigns against organized crime. RICO statutes were being developed that would target entire organizations, not just individual criminals. The Mafia was under assault. Colombo's response was unprecedented and brilliant in its audacity. Instead of hiding from public scrutiny, he'd embrace it. Instead of denying the Mafia's existence, he'd acknowledge Italian-American organized crime while claiming it was a cultural organization, not a criminal one. He'd turn the FBI's investigation into an attack on all Italian Americans, transforming himself from a criminal into a civil rights leader. In April 1970, Colombo founded the Italian American Civil Rights League, ostensibly created to combat negative stereotypes of Italian Americans. The organization was actually a public relations front to deny the Mafia's existence and improve mobsters' public image. But it was also something more, a genuine movement that tapped into Italian Americans' frustration with discrimination and stereotyping. The League organized protests outside FBI headquarters, claiming federal persecution of Italians. They held massive rallies in Columbus Circle, drawing tens of thousands of supporters. They pressured producers and networks to stop using terms like Mafia and Cosa Nostra in movies and television. Remarkably, some actually complied. The first Godfather film was careful to avoid using those specific terms. I attended one of the Unity Day rallies in 1970, more out of curiosity than support. Columbus Circle was packed with people, families, politicians, celebrities, and, mixed in among them, mobsters who were suddenly presenting themselves as civil rights activists. Joe Colombo stood on stage, looking every inch the legitimate community leader, speaking about Italian pride and fighting discrimination. It was surreal and brilliant, but not everyone in the mob approved. The old-school bosses thought Colombo was drawing unnecessary attention. Carlo Gambino, now the most powerful boss in New York, was particularly displeased. The whole point of the modern mafia was to operate quietly, to make money without headlines. Colombo was doing the opposite, putting himself on television and making the mob a national story. And then there was Joey Gallo, released from prison in March 1971, who saw Colombo's success and wanted to share. The Second Colombo War. When Joey Gallo walked out of prison in 1971, he was a different man from the one who'd gone in. He'd served 9 years, and during that time, he'd missed the entire swinging 60s. The world had changed, and Joey had changed with it. He saw himself not just as a gangster, but as a revolutionary, someone who could reshape the Mafia for a new era. Colombo tried to make peace with Gallo, reportedly offering him $1,000 as a welcome home gift. But Joey refused it, seeing the offer as an insult. He wanted a bigger piece of the action, wanted respect and territory that matched what he believed he'd earned. Colombo, secure in his position and unwilling to reward someone who'd once rebelled against Prophesy, refused. The Second Colombo War was about to begin, but this time it would be different. Joey had his black allies from prison, men who were now his soldiers and enforcers. This was revolutionary, a mafia crew that wasn't all Italian, that crossed racial lines in pursuit of power and money. The traditional bosses were horrified, but they were also concerned. Joey's crew was unpredictable and operated outside the usual mafia networks. On June 28, 1971, at the Second Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle, Joseph Colombo stood before a crowd of 40,000 supporters. He was at the height of his power and fame, a mob boss who'd become a civil rights leader. As he prepared to speak, a young black man named Jerome Johnson approached, claiming to be a photographer. Johnson pulled out a gun and shot Colombo 3 times in the head and neck at point-blank range. Colombo's bodyguards immediately shot Johnson dead on the spot. Colombo survived, but was paralyzed and brain damaged, unable to speak or function. He'd lived for another 7 years in a vegetative state before dying in 1978. But his active life ended that day on the stage in Columbus Circle. The shooter, Jerome Johnson, was a small-time criminal with no apparent mafia connections. But he was black, and he'd somehow gotten close enough to shoot a mob boss surrounded by security. Suspicion immediately fell on Joey Gallo. Had he used his black associates to carry out a hit that no Italian could have accomplished? Johnson was dead, killed instantly by Colombo's guards, so he couldn't be questioned. But the message was clear enough. If Joey did it, he was announcing that he'd won. Whether or not Gallo was actually behind the Colombo shooting remains disputed. Some investigators believed he was. Others thought the hit was ordered by Carlo Gambino or other bosses who wanted Colombo removed. What's certain is that everyone blamed Joey, and in the mob, perception matters more than truth. The death of Crazy Joe. The months following Colombo's shooting were tense. Joey Gallo walked around Little Italy like he owned it, dining at restaurants, attending Broadway shows with his new wife Sina, and hanging out with celebrities. He became friendly with actor Jerry Orbach, who was starring in the play The Gang's All Here. Gallo loved the theater, loved being around artists and intellectuals who found his combination of violence and philosophy fascinating. Bob Dylan wrote a song about him, Joey, painting him as a misunderstood rebel fighting against an unjust system. The lyrics portrayed Gallo as a Robin Hood figure, a man of the people who'd been destroyed by the establishment. It was nonsense, of course. Joey was a killer and extortionist, but it showed how successfully he'd cultivated his image as something more than just another mobster. On April 7th, 1972, Joey decided to celebrate his 43rd birthday. He gathered his family, his new wife Sina, his daughter, his sister, and her fiancé, and they went to dinner at the Copacabana. After the show, hungry and happy, they decided to get something to eat at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. It was about 4:30 a.m. when they walked into Umberto's. The restaurant was nearly empty, just the Gallo party and a few staff members cleaning up. They sat down and ordered food. Joey had his back to the door, a violation of mob protocol, but he was relaxed, surrounded by family, celebrating his birthday. That's when the door opened and 3 men walked in. The final moments. I was outside, smoking a cigarette when I heard the shots. Even now, decades later, I can hear them, sharp, loud cracks that echoed off the buildings. Inside Umberto's, chaos erupted. According to witnesses, the 3 men came in shooting. Joey jumped up, trying to pull his own gun, but he'd been caught completely off guard. Bullets hit him in the back and buttocks. He staggered toward the door, trying to escape, crashing through tables and chairs, blood spreading across his shirt. He made it to the sidewalk before collapsing. By the time I reached him, Joey Gallo was dead, lying on his back on Hester Street, his eyes open, his 43rd birthday ending in the same violence he'd spent his life inflicting on others. His family was screaming. His wife was hysterical. The whole neighborhood was waking up to the sound of gunfire and sirens. The killers disappeared into the night. No one was ever officially charged with Joey Gallo's murder, though everyone knew it was ordered by the Colombo family as revenge for the shooting of their boss. The 3 shooters were likely Colombo soldiers, sent to settle accounts and restore family honor. Joey died as he'd lived, violently, dramatically, and on his own terms right up until someone else's terms caught up with him. He'd challenged the system, broken the rules, befriended people he shouldn't have befriended, and ultimately paid the price. The barbershop quartet had sung its final note, the price of rebellion. Looking back across these 3 lives, Albert Anastasia, Joe Colombo, and Joey Gallo, a pattern emerges that tells us something important about power, rebellion, and the limits of both. Albert Anastasia thought his capacity for violence made him untouchable. For decades, he was right. He killed with impunity, ruled Murder Incorporated, and rose to boss of his own family. But his brutality became a liability. When he killed Arnold Schuster for no strategic reason, he proved to other bosses that he was too unstable to lead. His violence, which had been his greatest weapon, became the justification for his elimination. He was shot in a barbershop because the men he'd terrified for years decided he was more dangerous alive than dead. Joe Colombo thought he could legitimize the mob through public relations and political organizing. For a brief moment, it worked brilliantly. He transformed himself from a criminal into a civil rights leader, held massive rallies, and forced the FBI to back down from some investigations. But his success made other bosses nervous. He was drawing attention when they wanted anonymity. Whether it was Joey Gallo or other bosses who ordered the hit, Colombo was shot down at his own rally, his movement dying with him. He spent the last 7 years of his life unable to speak, think, or move, a living ghost of his own ambitions. Joey Gallo thought he was smarter than the system, that his intelligence and willingness to break rules would allow him to reshape the Mafia for a modern era. He read philosophy in prison, built alliances across racial lines, and cultivated friendships with celebrities. He saw himself as a revolutionary. But the mob doesn't reward revolutionaries, it kills them. Joey died on a sidewalk in Little Italy, shot in the back on his birthday, killed for daring to challenge the established order. The system always wins. What these three men's stories reveal is a hard truth about organized crime, and perhaps about any hierarchical power structure. The system is stronger than any individual, no matter how violent, charismatic, or clever they are. Anastasia killed hundreds, maybe thousands of people. He beat death row, survived countless wars, and inspired more fear than almost anyone in Mafia history. But when the system decided he needed to go, he died in a barbershop chair, killed by men who understood that no one was irreplaceable. Colombo built a legitimate organization with 50,000 members, held rallies that drew massive crowds, and appeared on national television as a civil rights leader. But when he threatened the established order by drawing too much attention, he was shot in the head at his own event. The system destroyed him for being too successful at changing the narrative. Gallo was smart enough to read Sartre, innovative enough to build a multiracial crew, and bold enough to kidnap his own bosses. But the system didn't care about his intelligence or innovation. When he refused to follow the rules, when he killed, or was believed to have killed, a boss, the system eliminated him with the same casual efficiency it had eliminated thousands before him. The human cost. But the real tragedy isn't what happened to these three men. They chose the life, understood the risks, and lived by violence. The tragedy is what they did to others, the countless victims whose names we don't remember, whose stories were never told, whose lives were ended or destroyed by men who saw other human beings as obstacles, opportunities, or entertainment. Albert Anastasia personally killed dozens of people and ordered hundreds more executions through Murder Incorporated. Each one was somebody's son, husband, father, brother. Each murder destroyed families, left children without parents, and spread suffering that echoed through generations. Joe Colombo, for all his civil rights rhetoric, still ran a criminal organization that profited from extortion, loan sharking, and gambling. His legitimate movement was built on illegitimate money extracted from struggling business owners and desperate gamblers. The families he helped through the Italian-American Civil Rights League were funded by the suffering of other families. Joey Gallo was a killer who'd committed his first murder as a young man and continued killing throughout his career. He extorted business owners, ran protection rackets, and used violence to build his jukebox empire. His friendship with Bob Dylan and Jerry Orbach doesn't erase the lives he destroyed. The witnesses who disappeared. I think about the witnesses who testified against Anastasia in his first murder trial, then suddenly changed their stories, allowing him to walk free. What happened to them? What threats were made? What prices paid? What terror inflicted to ensure their silence? Anastasia's escape from death row in 1922 was just the first time witnesses mysteriously failed to testify. It happened again and again throughout his career. I think about Abe Reles, the Murder Incorporated killer who turned informant and was prepared to testify against Anastasia. On November 12, 1941, while under police protection in a Coney Island hotel, Reles somehow fell from a 6th-floor window and died. The official story was suicide or an escape attempt gone wrong. Everyone knew it was murder, that somehow Anastasia's reach extended even into protective custody. Rella's death ensured that Murder Incorporated's most dangerous secrets died with him. I think about Jerome Johnson, the young black man who shot Joe Colombo at Columbus Circle. Whether he was a patsy, a willing participant, or something else, he was killed instantly by Colombo's bodyguards. Dead men tell no tales, and Johnson never got to explain who sent him or why. His death ensured the truth remained buried. And I think about the small business owners who refused to buy Joey Gallo's jukeboxes, the ones who stood up to extortion and paid for it. How many businesses were firebombed? How many owners were beaten? How many families lost everything because they refused to submit to organized crime's demands? The myth versus reality. Popular culture has romanticized these men, particularly Joey Gallo. Bob Dylan's song Joey portrays him as a folk hero. Movies have depicted him as a misunderstood intellectual trapped in a violent world. Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola have created compelling mob characters inspired by men like these. But the reality was uglier than any movie. These weren't anti-heroes fighting against an unjust system. They were criminals who chose to make their living through fear, violence, and exploitation. They weren't revolutionaries. They were gangsters who wanted bigger pieces of an illegal empire. Anastasia wasn't a loyal soldier protecting his family. He was a serial killer who enjoyed murder and happened to operate within organized crime structure. The fact that he killed for money instead of psychology doesn't make him less of a monster. Colombo wasn't a civil rights leader fighting discrimination. He was a mob boss using legitimate grievances to protect his criminal enterprise. The Italian-American Civil Rights League did some genuine good, but it was funded by illegal money and created to serve a criminal purpose. Gallo wasn't a philosophical rebel challenging the establishment. He was a gangster who read books and thought that made him different from other gangsters. His innovation was crossing racial lines to build his crew, but he did it to increase his power, not to fight injustice. The system they served. All three men were ultimately servants of a system they claimed to challenge. Anastasia served as the Mafia's chief executioner, eliminating anyone who threatened the organization's power. Colombo rose through that same organization, following its rules until he made himself boss. Gallo spent his entire adult life trying to climb the ladder of an organization he simultaneously rebelled against. None of them truly challenged the system. They just wanted better positions within it. Anastasia wanted to be boss instead of underboss. Colombo wanted to legitimize his position while maintaining criminal profits. Gallo wanted respect and territory for bosses who didn't think he deserved either. Their rebellions were personal, not principled. They weren't fighting for justice or change. They were fighting for themselves, for more money, more power, more respect. When they challenged the system, it was because the system wasn't giving them what they wanted, not because the system itself was wrong. And the system, in each case, destroyed them. Anastasia was killed when other bosses decided he was a liability. Colombo was shot when his publicity campaign threatened the mob's preferred anonymity. Gallo was murdered for refusing to accept his place in the hierarchy and for allegedly killing a boss. Lessons from the barbershop. If there are lessons in these stories, they're about the nature of power and the price of challenging established orders, whether criminal or legitimate. First, violence as a primary tool has diminishing returns. Anastasia's capacity for brutality made him feared and powerful, but ultimately, it made him vulnerable. The same violence that elevated him gave other bosses justification to eliminate him. In any system, you can't sustain power through fear alone. Eventually, the people you've terrified unite against you. Second, publicity is dangerous for organizations that require secrecy. Colombo's civil rights movement was brilliant public relations, but it was terrible strategy for a criminal organization. The Mafia works best in shadows. By bringing it into the light, Colombo made it vulnerable to investigation, prosecution, and internal dissent from bosses who preferred the old ways. Third, intelligence and innovation don't override the fundamental requirements of any organization: loyalty and respect for hierarchy. Gallo was probably smarter than most mobsters. His willingness to build a multiracial crew was innovative. But his refusal to accept his position in the hierarchy and his alleged role in shooting a boss made him expendable. The system values compliance over innovation. The end of an era. These three men represented a transitional period in organized crime. Anastasia was old school, brutal, direct, and unconcerned with public opinion. He belonged to an earlier era when mobsters could kill openly and face few consequences. His death in 1957 marked the end of that era. Colombo represented an attempt at modernization, creating a public face for the mob, turning criminals into civil rights activists, using legitimate movements to protect illegal enterprises. For a brief moment in 1970 to 71, it seemed to work. But his shooting in 1971 proved that the Mafia couldn't be legitimized, that its criminal nature would always override any public relations campaign. Gallo was caught between eras. He had old-school violence, but new-school thinking. He wanted to reshape the mob for modern times, building crews based on ability rather than ethnicity, using intelligence and innovation rather than tradition. But the organization wasn't ready for that change. His death in 1972 showed that the mob would evolve on its own terms, slowly, not through revolutionary change imposed by a rebel captain. Today, organized crime looks different from the world these men knew. It's more corporate, more international, more focused on white-collar crimes, and less on territorial control. The neighborhood crews that defined the Mafia's golden age have largely disappeared, replaced by looser networks and more flexible organizations. But the fundamental dynamics remain. Power structures resist change. Individuals who challenge established orders risk destruction. Violence may bring temporary success, but creates enemies who eventually unite. And publicity, whether through civil rights movements or celebrity friendships, attracts attention that criminal organizations can't afford. Final memories. I'm old now. The Little Italy where Joey Gallo died has been transformed by gentrification and tourism. Umberto's Clam House moved locations and became a tourist attraction where people eat pasta and take photos at the table where Crazy Joe supposedly sat. The barbershop where Anastasia was killed is long gone, replaced by modern offices. Columbus Circle, where Colombo was shot, shows no trace of the rally that day or the movement that briefly flourished there. But I remember the fear in people's voices when Anastasia's name came up, the way even hardened criminals seemed nervous discussing him. I remember the excitement and confusion of Colombo's Unity Day rallies, watching a mob boss become a civil rights leader before my eyes. And I remember that morning outside Umberto's, hearing gunshots and finding Joey Gallo dead on the sidewalk, his 43rd birthday celebration ending in blood. I remember these men not as heroes or even anti-heroes, but as deeply flawed human beings who made terrible choices and paid terrible prices. They were intelligent, charismatic, and ruthless. They could have been successful in legitimate fields. Instead, they chose crime, and crime consumed them. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner who'd killed hundreds, was shot in a barbershop chair at 55 years old. Joe Colombo, who'd become a national figure and civil rights leader, spent 7 years paralyzed and brain damaged before dying at 54. Joey Gallo, who'd befriended Bob Dylan and read Sartre in prison, was gunned down at 43 on his birthday. None of them died old. None of them died peacefully. None of them left lasting legacies beyond cautionary tales. Their violence brought them temporary power, but permanent enemies. Their rebellion against the system brought them notoriety, but guaranteed retaliation. Their intelligence couldn't save them from the consequences of their choices. The warning. If there's a warning in these stories, it's this. The criminal life offers no escape. You might rise to the top. You might become famous. You might even convince yourself you're different from other criminals. But in the end, the life catches up with everyone. Death comes violently, suddenly, and often for people you trusted or worked with. Anastasia was killed by men he knew, on orders from his own underboss. Colombo was shot at his own event, possibly by someone connected to his own organization. Gallo was murdered by the family he'd been part of his entire career, killed for breaking rules he'd always known existed. The Barbershop Quartet sang its final song decades ago. The men who made up that quartet, whether literally or metaphorically, are all gone now, killed by the same violence they'd spent their lives perpetrating. Their stories live on in movies, songs, and books, often romanticized and distorted. But the truth is simpler and sadder than any Hollywood version. They were killers who died violently, criminals who left trails of suffering, men who chose power over everything else and lost everything in the end. I was there for parts of their stories. I saw the fear they inspired, the damage they caused, and the violent ends they met. And what I learned, watching these brilliant, dangerous men destroy themselves and countless others, is that crime doesn't pay. Violence only creates more violence, and rebellion without principle is just another form of self-destruction. The system always wins. The Barbershop Quartet learned that lesson the hardest way possible. I'm just grateful I survived long enough to tell their story.